Many men judge progress by body weight. If the scale is stable, they assume the system is stable. But after 40, that can be misleading because the body can look similar in total weight while changing in composition and risk profile underneath. The waistline often tells that story first. Pants fit differently, the midsection feels denser, energy becomes less stable, recovery worsens, yet the scale may barely move. That is why abdominal gain matters. It is not just extra weight. It often signals that the body is storing risk in a more disruptive place. Let's look at the mechanism behind this. Visceral fat behaves differently from weight in general. It is not just passive storage, it is metabolically active tissue. That distinction matters more than most men realize. Subcutaneous fat, the kind you can pinch under the skin, is relatively inert. It stores energy. It insulates. It mostly sits there. But visceral fat, the kind that wraps around internal organs in the abdominal cavity, is different. It actively secretes hormones, inflammatory cytokines, and signaling molecules that interact with the rest of the body. Research links visceral adiposity more strongly to metabolic syndrome and cardiometabolic risk than total body weight alone. That matters because abdominal fat changes the environment the rest of the system has to operate in. It influences inflammatory tone. It influences insulin sensitivity. It influences lipid handling. It can even affect hormone metabolism and blood pressure regulation. So the body is not only carrying more tissue, it is carrying a more disruptive signaling pattern, and that pattern creates downstream consequences that show up in energy, recovery, metabolic stability, and long-term health risk. That is also why waist circumference can predict mortality across BMI categories. In other words, two men can have the same body weight or similar BMI, but the one carrying more central abdominal fat may still be operating from a less favorable metabolic state. That is not just a cosmetic difference, it is a systems difference. One man may have a body weight of 185 pounds with most of it distributed as muscle and subcutaneous fat. Another man may also weigh 185 pounds, but with significantly more visceral fat concentrated around the midsection. On paper, they look the same, but metabolically, they are not equivalent. And after 40, those differences matter more because recovery capacity is already less forgiving than it used to be. Research also suggests exercise can improve abdominal obesity markers and inflammatory response in older adults. That matters because it tells us this is not a fixed destiny. The system is still modifiable. But it also means that a narrow focus on total weight can hide what is actually improving or worsening. A man can lose scale weight while losing too much structure. He might drop 10 pounds, but if most of that came from muscle rather than visceral fat, his metabolic position may have worsened, not improved, or he can stay at the same scale weight while moving to a worse abdominal risk profile. The scale stays flat, but the waist expands as muscle is quietly replaced by fat. That is why the waist matters. It is often one of the clearest places where metabolic drift becomes visible. And it gives you information that the scale simply cannot provide. Now for the intervention layer. The useful experiment is to start measuring the system where risk accumulates. That means the waistline matters. Not obsessively, not emotionally, but practically. Waist circumference is often a better feedback tool than body weight alone because it tells you whether the specific tissue pattern associated with higher risk is moving in the right direction. And when the waist is moving up, the response should not be panic dieting. It should be better system design, more walking, more resistance training, better meal structure, less constant overeating, less passive snacking, more sleep consistency. Why does that matter? Because abdominal fat rarely grows in isolation. It usually grows inside a broader pattern: poor recovery, excess calorie drift, too much sitting, too little muscular demand, and too little attention to how the body handles energy over the week. You cannot fix visceral fat accumulation with a single tactic. It is not just about eating less or doing more cardio. It requires addressing the underlying operating system that allowed the fat to accumulate in the first place. That is why belly fat should not be approached like a single cosmetic problem. It is a systems report. If the waist is increasing, you are usually looking at some combination of reduced muscle demand, worse appetite regulation, poorer glucose handling, and lower overall energy flux. Each of those factors feeds into the others. Less muscle demand means less glucose disposal capacity. Worse glucose handling means more fat storage. More fat storage means worse inflammatory signaling. Worse inflammation means poorer recovery and energy regulation, and the cycle continues. So the practical intervention is not simply eat less, it is to restore a better operating pattern, training that preserves muscle, movement that raises daily energy use, nutrition that reduces repeated overconsumption, enough sleep that appetite and recovery are not constantly distorted. This is slower than crash dieting, but it is strategically better. Crash dieting often produces rapid-scale weight loss, but much of that loss may come from water, glycogen, and lean tissue. The waist may shrink temporarily, but the underlying metabolic dysfunction often remains. And when the diet ends, the weight typically returns, often preferentially to the abdominal region. That is why sustainable fat loss requires patience and system-level thinking, because the goal is not only getting lighter, the goal is becoming metabolically quieter and structurally stronger at the same time. That is a better longevity trade. Here is the system interaction to keep in mind. The trade-off is that aggressive weight loss can reduce total mass while failing to improve the full system. If the waist comes down, but strength collapses, energy worsens, and adherence disappears, the strategy may still be too expensive. You want the abdominal risk signal moving down without sacrificing the structural reserve that helps protect long-term function. That is why the best plans are rarely the most dramatic. They are the ones that reduce the right tissue while preserving the right tissue. After 40, the scale can hide what the waist reveals. Belly fat matters because it is not just extra mass, it is often a louder metabolic signal.